Hey, family. Um, this is your host, John Solders, and I'm uh, happy to be with you here again. Doing what one of the things that I do is get to do these kinds of shows and host these kinds of conversations with some of my friends, some of my some interesting folk. Let me just be clear, people that are interesting and smart and sometimes prolific, um, uh, sometimes funny, but for sure full of knowledge, information, and spirit. And I got one of these kinds of guests that will be joining us in just a minute. I can't. It's hard for me because this particular guest, he and I are brothers. I can hardly remember a time that this young man has not been a part of my life personally. We are brothers indeed. And from the very moment, I can remember the very first time I came in contact with this, my brother. And from there on, there's been a kind of history and histrionics, shall I call it, with our relationship. And I'm so proud of him. I love him dearly. He is he's the associate professor of Black Studies and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he's a smart dude. He's funny. He's extremely talented, and we're just gonna chop it up a bit, and talk about lots of different things. And prayerfully, we land on something that's gonna connect to you. Let me bring to you, Dr. Johari Jabir. Welcome to this platform, sir, bruh, and greet the peoples. Greet the peoples.
It's good to be here with you. We are very lifelong friends, and all of those things you were saying about being smart and intelligent, I kept thinking to myself, well, I don't know why he asked me, especially at this time of the day when I feel like sort of all the air has left. Energy is really low, but it's good to see you, and this for me will be just an extension of many years of conversation around various topics and goings on in the culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, First, let me. Can I just do a little introducing of you and bragging on you a bit? That's from my perspective. But you talk about where you've come from. We are both products of St. Louis. St. Louis public schools. Let me rep that right here, right now. Let's put this right on the thing.
Beaumont 82, baby. Beaumont, all the Blue Jackets, 1982. Yes.
Yes. I did take a little detour from kindergarten through eighth grade. It was public schools, and then my mama said gone over there to the other people. So I would have went to Beaumont, and it would have been 81. Would have been 81 right there. And then you did a little bit of work, and then went on to get an undergraduate degree at one of our local universities in the St. Louis area, at Fontbonne. You're a lifelong musician and singer. God, Lord, y'all don't even know. Woo, woo, Lord. And then went on to get a master's degree out in the Californias, and then went on to get the PhD. I'm just me. You know what? You know me, so I'm just me. And along the way, has done a number of different things, as we all have done, following our passions, following a bit of, I said this the other day, yesterday, in fact. I said history is not a straight line.
Mm.
It's not a straight line. It's wiggly and squiggly and curvy. Um, I thought I would never be more proud of you when you got the gig, and all of a sudden you was on the Broadways and musical directing and carrying on, and conducting and carrying, and in the theater. in the theater, doing musical theater, and then said, okay, it's time to now to follow the scholarship and to do what you have done, and now have landed a tenured track professor, tenured professor, and so just from around the way in St. Louis, north side, you was more downtown than me,
I
but
was.
north side more, but
If I could jump in, I know you will do as any sibling from St. Louis would do, which is to sort of trot out achievements and such the like. But I'm very much a Black working class kid from St. Louis, and I also understand, thanks to good religion, with a group of Black working class Baptists, I understand that I am not any of those things, that I'm consciousness. And so, but I know you, I know that that's what, my family does. Um, and, and it's beautiful to be seen as that kid, as that curious kid. I'm still very curious about the world. I think that's the one of the benefits of working in the ways that I now work, is I get a chance to still be very curious.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, one more thing I'm gonna be proud of.
Okay.
You're a published author.
Okay.
And so I know, and I know him. So he none of this he likes at all. Just let's go with it. But I have to talk about this book, Conjuring Freedom. This book, published. You published this. This was published when? A few years
Um,
ago, right?
I think it's 2018.
Yeah, yeah,
Am I right?
yeah.
I'm
I
not.
think that's right. I think that's right. Let me look and just double check to me. 2017.
17. Okay. All
2017,
right.
Ohio State University Press, right?
Yes.
And an interesting book. So why don't we begin here? Because I think this.
I'm gonna adjust this. We love the
Sure.
sun, but okay, that's a little better.
Yes. Um,
Ooh, it's still.
that's okay. Um, now, now, now. What I thought we would spend time talking about, and we have far field conversations. We save the world, world changing conversations. The French have a phrase that means world changing conversations, and we have that. I mean, every time we talk, just about we gonna change the world, and we leave it, to the next time we change it again. Uh, but the book spends time in a very interesting place, a very interesting kind of nexus, if you will, of who we are culturally. When I say we, I'm always asking the question, who is the we, right? I'm interested about the we. But when I say the we, I'm really speaking of Black people, African Americans of a particular kind and type. Again, you get to know that you can't just speak globally, and it's for everybody, speaking in our vernacular. There's a particular kind, but this particular cultural collection, I'll call it that, in and around how some of us be together, and how we address both ourselves, each other, our setting, our context, if you will, and we use art and music and spirituality, and they kind of all convene there. This book is some of that in the context or in the setting, as you did some research in one of the colored regiments of the Civil War in South Carolina. So could
Mhm.
you talk a little bit about how you got there? Let's start there. How did you get there? And I know some of the other stuff we'll talk about, of your adjacent projects, if you will. But how did you get there?
Well, I came across, as an undergraduate, I was a music major, as you know, and I came across a document in the library that was the diary of a Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and he was the colonel of the first Black regiment of the Civil War, and that's what the book is about. So he was a primary source document, and he was the first to publish the lyrics to 35 spirituals that he heard this regiment called the First South Carolina Volunteers. There had been attempts to enlist Black men for at least the first year of the war, but Lincoln was opposed to it. And being the politician that he was, and the state of the war was not going well for the Union side of the army, and so he eventually, opens the enlistment process to Black people and Black women. I talk about this in the book. Black women enlist in regiments, and this regiment that I write about, they're kind of like a contraband regiment, and contraband was the term to maintain the status of Black people as property and not yet citizens. So I came across that document, and I was really struck by what must it have sounded like for a regiment, mostly of Black men, some women, but the male voices, because as you know, I'm also a choral man, and so I was very curious about what must that singing have sounded like, and that question stayed with me. And again, in seminary, Harry Belafonte published a kind of massive anthology of Black music, and these recordings had been sitting in a vault somewhere. And when that came out, there were some of the Civil War songs, and I went back to that memoir, that document again, and at the same time that I was asking questions about music and masculinity, could the songs be a mode by which these Black men are constructing ideas of manhood? Right? This soldier, and the soldier and the singing is the sort of trope I was working with. At that same time, I was also thinking about Reverend Cleveland. And when he died in 1991, I was really confused about the church, um, confused about my role in it, confused about the Black church in this society, and I was just really perplexed how people responded to his death. So in very nasty ways, and it was fitting, John. It was in the context, right, 91, of what has happened in the 80s and 90s with so much civil rights backlash, with a crack epidemic, with an expanding incarceral statehood, all of those things. And there's a way in which I saw in the Civil War the same problem of Black citizenship and the potential of music to be a kind of curative dimension. So by the time I got to the dissertation stage, my advisor, and he was right, he said, you think a lot about the soldiers more than you do about Reverend Cleveland right now. Maybe the maybe the soldiers is the project, and that was true. And so I finished the degree, started in the profession, which was very late, for someone. So I entered the profession, and needed a first book. And so I already had the material, but I wanted to do something very different than, what I needed to do in the dissertation stage. And so I sort of wrote my book, my version of that. And it's out in the world. And I'm now on to the book project for Reverend Cleveland. So that's the story. I think that, did I answer much of what you might have been curious about in terms of the book?
Sure, of course, and of course, there's so many colliding and intersecting discourses that we've had ad nauseum. I remember having the conversations when we were teenagers, when we were kids, around what it must mean well, what it did mean to us, but then also what it must mean to others as we struggle to find what our identities were, who we were becoming as young Black men in a violence riddled society, community, neighborhood, even. But also what that means as we traversed in other spaces and places where that wasn't, it wasn't so trauma based, right? And so I'm interested in the connection, because what you do I get at is that the struggle for citizenship came concurrent with the struggle for who will these men and women, who will we be in the world as we are fighting for our own freedom, because that's in fact what all of those who were in enveloped in the crusade, and I'll say during the Civil War, they were fighting for themselves. They weren't somehow the narratives that the Union was fighting for, something. Black people fought for their own freedom. And they were in the process of becoming, while also building what that may have meant in a Southern context, and ultimately, as it panned out within our own, where we come from, and have that weighed in. Talk a little bit about what pressed you into thinking that into talking about the relationship of identity or identities and freedom, quite frankly, and then I want to pull in the spirit part ultimately.
Quite, honestly, identity really isn't my thing. I really, I mean, it's something that I'm curious about, but it really, I mean, identity in and of itself, the way it's often extracted, that's sort of not my forte. Let's just put it politely. So um, I was really curious, and I remain curious about the kind of conundrums of Black people in racial capitalism. That's that's what I'm very, but I'm not so much driven by a pure or pedestrian idea of Blackness in and of itself. My lens is Pan-Africanist in that regard. So I remember a couple of times I gave interviews about the book, and a couple of people were saying things about Black men that, with reference to the book, and I was like, well, I'm not saying that. So the book, as you know, and as you've read it, it's not about valorizing Black sort of military manhood. It's not about that. It is about what you say in the way of self-emancipation. That the each of the wars um, leading up to the end of slavery, each of those wars had been opportunities for Black people. They were not solely sort of patriotic. They were tools, right, for Black people's own self-emancipation. And as such, I'm always coming back to the question of what is the America that Black people imagine that is not solely about being included in a very violent system, right? Like Jimmy Baldwin said, why would I want to be integrated into a burning house? So, I mean, that seeing the question that way really reflects that at UCSB as a graduate student, I was trained by people in the Black radical tradition. And so I'm really curious about the root of Black humanity as an African root. Um, and a framing of the questions that can hold identity as more as a politics of inclusion rather than an identity or pigment, right? Solely based on that. So I feel like I'm kind of rambling.
No, you're right on it. I use identity with my language fails me, right? but what you're talking about, what I am naming, it is coming through seeing oneself, and then making a declarative statement, or living a declarative life, not knowing all of what that means, but knowing that it is this. So for example, for you and I, when we rep St. Louis, and we're that see, you have to be from that to know what that means for real, right? And there's a kind of there's a declaration of that only you can make.
Well, and it is even more, I think, important to particularize the race and class, and that when we do rep it, we are talking about the Black working class of St. Louis, and that is a very particular tradition of music, as you know, but also of activism, of struggle. So yeah, that's right. And I sometimes think when you just said the language fails you, I think you're right. It fails me too, because I often feel like it doesn't allow us to name that race and class piece that is just at the core of who you and I are. It's there, right? So yeah.
So I'm at Leppingwell, Dayton.
Oh yes.
I am at the storefront church behind the beautiful edifice, but I'm hearing Miss Hannah on them pianos and I'm hearing Cecil on that top, and I'm hearing a sound coming out of the Crystal Peace Choral Club.
Oh,
right?
Lord.
So, and I can't, that's a particular, right? And there is some universality to it, but it's a particular. And that sound, Getaway Jordan, it's not the trite praise and worship numbers. Now, let me, for those of you who don't know what I'm speaking of, I'm speaking about a very particular gospel music idiom, but it is a sound that was so transgressive, right?
Yes.
That. So, can you talk a little bit about that, because your book actually gets to that? It now you want, that's a root, that's a thread throughout the book. Now you got a fancy name for it and all of that. This is some fancy, you done went to school. It's a fancy name for all what I'm talking about. But that's a through line. So while we're talking about, what's declarative about what you discovered in these soldiers and their practice of that, there's a connection that's a through line to what we've always been and what we've always known.
Yeah, well, the fancy word you're referring to, and I kind of think all of my scholarship is concerned with epistemology and spirituality. I think that's certainly at the heart of it, and I'm glad you invoked the core club of my childhood church, because what I saw in the soldiers was something that I saw in the core club. That my church was filled with these Southern migrants, right? These were Black people who landed in St. Louis in the early years of the migration, and Prince of Peace was formed very, very early in the 1900s. And, people from Alabama, from Tennessee, my folks are from Mississippi, all these places, and they arrive. And to me, John, and I have no empirical proof of this, but to me, Prince of Peace, out of all of the Baptist churches in St. Louis, Prince of Peace was the most Southern. And so I was always curious, how is it that these people arrive from all of these places in the South, and they seem to arrive knowing something that they all know? And so when the soldiers enlist in this regiment in South Carolina, they're from far away places beyond South Carolina, but they have in common the ring shout. And I was curious about that as a knowledge, as a way of knowing, an epistemology. Clyde Woods called it, with regard to the blues, he called it the blues epistemology, which he described as the long-standing Black tradition of knowing. And so that was what I was curious about, is that how could I see this thing in the 20th century and it's also in the 19th century? Well, it's because it's a knowing that we've maintained. It's a way of knowing that, when some of us get together, we sort of know some things about how to make culture and how to be together, how to make spaces of belonging. So yeah, that became the kind of foundation of the book, and what we know how to do is to conjure the spirit. And in the book, I refer to it as the collective will to conjure. That we could be technically strangers, but if we arrive with this common knowing, we arrive with a will to conjure the spirit. And so all of these people, from across the country in the 19th century enlist in this regiment. And it's the only regiment where this practice is this prevalent, is in South Carolina. It's the only, it's not in the 54th Mass from Boston. But this particular regiment had, this practice of nightly ring shouts. And that's what I saw the Core Club do. It's true to an Africanist principle that, where there is no music, the spirit will not come. So yeah, that's what's been holding it together. And I see it in Reverend Cleveland, who sort of leads a service, and he could be in the ballroom, he could be in an arena, but he operates like a kind of mystic, some spiritual knowledge that he has. And I think it's very African. And I also think it's very queer. I think it unsettles the sort of sureness of heteronormativity. I think it undermines it, because the spirit is not bound by gender binaries. So as a way to sort of connect these two projects.
Well, Dr. Greg Carr talks about in his he kind of has a way to see Africana studies, and one of the way he gets at that, he talks about, there's a way in which there's a governance part of this, there's a social part of this, but he also talks about in Africana studies, it's a through line. It's the ways of knowing. How do we know what we know, and how do we get together and all of a sudden it's there in the midst of it? And I was passing around to two of our brothers, because I those that know me, you all know I'm a church fella, and so there's a video, and it just happened to come across it in social media, and there's a sister on the street at one of these kind of street revivals, and I'm accustomed to it. You are too. I know what that setting is. She got a tambourine, and she starts with "Power, Lord, need more power, power, Lord, power," and it takes off from there, and the ring shout occurs. What we would call and I just it moves me in a place that I'm not moved in much else. And then I think in part because it taps into a root of memory that's both of my contextual memory, what I lived through, but it's also something that's in my DNA almost. So that I hear that same sound. I'll call it a sound. I hear that same sound when I was in Brazil at a ceremony, a sacred ceremony, and all of a sudden I heard that sound, and I knew exactly what it was, and it arrested me in one sense, and then it created and provided for me transcendence, so that I didn't know the language. I didn't even know what they was really singing about until I did, but I knew all of it all at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I kind of mentioned in the book about Candomblé, Santeria, and sort of a black worship. So all of this is about the circuit of black religion and the collective will to conjure. Everywhere throughout the diaspora, black people raise that knowledge, and it's, I'm glad you cited that song, because in a part of doing research for the book, I traveled to South Carolina um around the 1st of January. In fact, I think I got there on like the 29th of December, because I wanted to go to Mother Emanuel Church and to be part of a watch night service, because that's also something that was born in the Civil War, is that Black people would gather at churches or community centers and have praise services with the hope that the Emancipation Proclamation would be read. And so I wanted to be in that particular church for that service. And true enough, it was, all that and more. And but there was, on January 1st, on New Year's Day, there was the church hosted another service under what was called Emancipation Oak, under this big oak tree where the Emancipation Proclamation was read. And they started out with a song that went a lot like that, with the gullah clap. Right now, I've heard that in New Orleans, right? And it's subject to break off in any kind of church service, but it is a sort of spiritual knowledge that's not bound by denomination. It's not bound by a particular religious modality. You could watch a Sufi dervish, and you'd have the same thing. So it then behooves us to recognize it, you know, and to recognize it for the power that it comes to transform us.
And it then has it transforms us individually, collectively, and what I would say communally, as we are having common union together.
Yes.
It is what happens with our parents and our foreparents when they start singing "We Shall Overcome." We can't sing it like they sing it, right? There's a thing that happens when they sing that, or there's a thing that happens when "Lift Every Voice and Sing" is raised of a certain kind, and just something happens there. And it is that not only transcend in a spiritual context, it also shapes for what and maybe you were thinking about this, I don't know, when in conjure, it brings something to that space that you don't get to be the same afterwards, individually or collectively. We don't get to be the same, after that. And you see it in the civil rights movement. You saw it certainly in the Black Lives Matter movement in both I would say the 2014 version of it and then 2020 again, right? Hell, you talking about, summon that, that there was a thing with the drums and the beat and the calling of the names and the clapping of the hands and the stomping of the feet. That certainly we bring that right. That's straight from a kind of deep Africanness, right? That others just don't have it in the same way.
No, our spirituality is embodied spirituality, and so we were not people ashamed of the body, and the body was never separated from the soul, and the soul from the mind, and all of those Cartesian splits. That isn't, that's not really how the tradition reads. So much about Black studies has wrestled with what to do with religion. Um, that's that, but if you understand religion as a human dimension, in which human beings ask questions around their ultimate existence, it could move you closer to understanding Black people's religious traditions, rather than focusing only on a kind of colonial Christianity and an encounter of the African with colonial Christianity, in which we read the history as if they had no agency to make something out of it. And the phrase I use in the book, and I use a similar phrase with regard to Cleveland, is, to hear those toxic preachments. Then they went back into the woods and rechanted those Dr. Watts hymns and turned poison into medicine. Um, Now, in racial capitalism, once you institutionalize that, then at many of the churches, just becomes a space of upward mobility. But the very root of it is about something else. Is really about what Thurman called the religion of Jesus, because they saw in the Christ, they saw in him somebody who suffered at the hands of empire.
And that connection then becomes, again, that's for me is the transgressiveness of it, right?
Yeah.
That then it becomes a way in which it's my through line to get me through the week of hell that I've got to deal with, that our foreparents and others, dealt with in their regular, their ordinary, in their everyday. And you talk about a doctor who says, "Love the Lord, He heard my cry." That there ain't nothing like that in all the world.
No, I really miss that. I so wish, because I grew up on long meter hymns, which they really stretch it. And I wish I could find a recording. I was saying, speaking of which, I was saying to my pastor, Norman Owens, the last time we spoke, how much I miss that sound. Yeah, it's stereophonic. It's with me. It's definitely with me. But yeah, what an enormous grace to have had that, as a foundation.
Yeah, my I have a great uncle, Uncle Johns Robinson, who used to do do say do mi do so. Oh
Yeah.
my God! And they would have conferences, conventions they called it down in Mississippi, and they would that sound was so beautiful to me.
Yeah.
Shape note singing is
Yes.
what is
Yes.
commonly known as,
Yes,
and
indeed. Yeah.
they that I was recently heard some foolishness related to one of the founders of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that made
Oh,
some
yeah.
claims.
Poor
Um,
thing.
yeah, right. And I don't want to regurgitate any of that, but as to say all of this music here in the grand old United States of America has a Black African root, and you can't explain that away. Banjos, they made them in Africa. Guitars, African instruments. Pianos are stringed, all the string, they're African instruments. And, anyway, you try to, you can't even, anyway, I'm not going to stay there. I want to spend a little bit of time. We talk a lot about, often we've talked about those individuals who represented for us a kind of technician of the sacred. These folk who were able to, and you referenced it when you talked about Reverend Cleveland. James Cleveland is who we're speaking of, Reverend James Cleveland. And for us, growing up when we did, he was the leader of a kind of tradition. He emerged as a leader, and his conference. I had Dr. Gentry on a number of months ago.
Oh, yeah, that's lovely. That was lovely.
So we were able to talk about Dr. Dorsey and the gospel music conventionings and convenience, and of the three, I would say three major ones. The Gospel Music Workshop of America is the second one, is one of those three that Reverend Cleveland founded and to forward gospel music. And I've watched him over and over again over the years, just know when to take the stage grab the mic and make something, I almost say magical, but make something very, very spiritual and mystical occur. It'll be often it would be, and I'm gonna say it in the vernacular. It'd be some raggedy choir singing some raggedy song, and all, and where people would, from a kind of bourgeois ethic, they'd be laughing at him, and all of a sudden, that old raggedy song would take on a thing, and all of a sudden, it would be the convention's anthem for the rest of the convention. Everybody would be sick. They'd be in the hall singing that old raggedy. What was a raggedy song all of a sudden becomes not a hit, but the song that moves us and speaks to us in a new way. He was genius with that, and there are others who are able. I call them, technicians of the sacred. Could you talk a little bit about that in the context of Reverend Cleveland and your work, but also related to what it's related to the larger body of work, I believe, that you are endeavoring to present and bring to the world.
Well, I mean that's actually one of my favorite things to think about with regard to him and researching and writing about him. But I think I only could recognize it because that again was at Prince of Peace. You're one of the few people that I could converse with in this way and say, you actually witnessed the Core Club, and so that they didn't look like a polished choir. In terms of a Western classical music framework, they did everything wrong, and yet there was a power that you couldn't deny when they sang. There was some power, and it was such a remarkable power that even if you were the most educated musician who knew everything technically was wrong with what they were doing, you had to admit, well, something else is going on here, and you had to set your technical education aside. And so I like to imagine this otherworldly history of the choral club. I know that most of, like my grandparents were sharecroppers. And so most of these people that arrived at Prince of Peace were sharecroppers working in the fields. And the choral club sounded as if somebody struck up a song in the fields and they all decided, we're pretty good, let's leave. And on the way, they stopped at a juke joint. And who would be playing at the juke joint but Hannah? And they became an ensemble and ended up in the city. That was the raw indigenous. That's my own sort of unofficial way of explaining this power from them. And when I interviewed this ties into Cleveland in this way. I interviewed a woman who'd been working with him for years, and she was telling me, and I don't recall the particular year, that they were in Philadelphia at the Met, and some raggedy choir, as you said, and and Reverend Cleveland, against the wishes of the board, Reverend Cleveland asked this choir to sing every night, and this choir wiped the place out. And she was telling me how, and I have seen him do this. I saw Reverend Cleveland do this with Perfect Peace with Keith Pringle singing that vamp, God will make a way out of no way. And I saw him do things with that song. And I saw the room, just the ballroom, just become just completely uninhabitable. And it had gotten to a point where he just said, shh. And that actually just tore the place up again. But that is classic him to me. And there is something technical about it, but it's a way of knowing that's not empirical. I have to just wonder, what was he hearing? And how did he know when at the right time to intervene in the ways that he did? And I think he's operating more like a mystic in these moments. I really do. I think he's it's much more mystic um, than, you know, very ordinary. So he was very gifted at that, and I think it has missed people. It happens to be, you know, in my introduction, it happens to be very prominent in the book, but I think that there was something a lot more pronounced in him than people talk about. And it is hard to talk about because it's not about memorizing scriptures. It's not about a pure Christian lifestyle. So, you know, this is about some other way of being in God's presence. And Reverend Cleveland knew how to usher people into the presence of the holy. He knew how to do that. I suspect it was a knowledge that must have been shaped by Reverend Charles Ashley Craig, because the spiritual church, to me, out of all of our traditions, the spiritual church had the best capacity for that. You know, it really embraced mysticism and African consciousness. And nobody, you know, we giving shout outs, but nobody in St. Louis did that better than the Archbishop Michael West. So yeah, that's a long-winded response, but I think there was in Reverend James Cleveland the capacity of a mystic, and it even makes sense in many sort of personal ways because mystics are non-dual, they're non-binary.
Yeah, yeah, and then yeah, I have so many stories. One I'll lift, well, I'll reference and then lift. He was able to not only do that he did, hands down, at any moment, that thing he did would change the course of a particular time and a season. He would make it shift, but he also provided an atmosphere so that other people could tap
Yeah,
into that.
yeah,
The story is still not told in the way that it should be told. Uh, um, a little known teenager was at his house, went in the living room and began to play his white grand piano. And that young man was Andre Crouch.
hmm.
And he wrote his very first song that is an anthem. All right. It's an anthem. And it will go down in history as one of the greatest gospel songs that has been. You know, uh, that song, you know, was written at James Cleveland's home.
Which song is
Um,
it?
his first song, "How Could I Say Thanks for the Things You've
Oh,
Done
to
for Me?
God be the glory.
God be the glory." That's that song. He was 14, 15 years old.
Wow.
And so that's what I mean. The way in which to take a hymn, "Peace Be Still."
Well, you know, that yeah, I mean that song is sort of married to him, and there were versions of it around already.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
I had the joy of interviewing George Jordan, who wrote "Jesus Can Work It Out," and you know, Cleveland's version of "Peace Be Still" is very much his version of it, and he was explaining to me all these versions of that hymn that were around. But this is also another point about Reverend Cleveland's life that I sort of excavate in the book is, you know, Cleveland was made king of gospel by forces that had nothing to do with his own will.
Mhm.
And and so there are all these other versions of that song that are around, but it's his version that changes the course of God. And he doesn't intend that. He doesn't, you know, he doesn't, I don't see anywhere in his life where he's intentional about being fabulous.
Right. He
Uh,
wasn't.
and you know, and he's born, you know, in 1931. In 1932, the one of those first two gospel choruses are at his home church, childhood
Mhm,
church of Pilgrim, right?
mhm.
So his life is a part of a kind of synergy of spirit that really helped to bring him into the platform that happened. And of course, people loved him. And I think the elders trusted him with certain gifts.
Mhm.
Um, so that Peace Be Still is a great example of that. That he's actually not doing that to try for it to be successful or any of those things.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
And
Reverend Cleveland was very committed to. I interviewed someone here, um, and he was very committed to encouraging young people to write repertoire for church choirs.
mm,
Do you know how far we are from that as an
ooh,
ethic?
ooh.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I know how. Yes, I know how far we are.
you
It,
know,
it, Reverend Cleveland took.
this stuff is profoundly political.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It
Profoundly
is.
political.
And so to your point, he then Tommy Whitfield
Mm.
uh, took that Peace Be Still, kind of put a jazzy edge on it, asked Vanessa Bell Armstrong to sing it, comes up with a kind of stylized version of it. It's James Cleveland's version, but it's got some jazzy
Yeah,
style, and it blows up. And then he goes back, he starts his version of the song
yeah,
and
yeah,
adds the
yeah,
the
yeah,
the modern guy,
yeah,
he adds Tommy Whitfield's tag on it, and all of a sudden it's a brand new song again, and
yeah,
he reintroduces his song with something new on. I watched him do that. Oh, he did it with any number of Quincy Jr. songs. Now
yeah.
I'm down in it now, but what should I do? Um, he would just, he would know when to do that number, and he would, in his way.
But look at all the songs you're naming. Look at the tempos. And that's really what happened with Reverend Cleveland is, before him, the music gospel didn't have that kind of spaciousness.
Mhm.
And he slows stuff way down. And every song that you're talking about is a contemplative gospel song.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's a part, that's a part of his gift that sort of doesn't get, I mean, it really grips, people like you and me. But I think it's more at the core of who he is and what appealed to people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
No Ways Tired, I
yeah,
mean, that
yeah,
all those gospel ballads and
yes.
the kind of space in that music that allows you to contemplate, right? To be in the presence of God. Um, yeah,
And let's be clear. He also had a special touch, so that when Aretha was at a low, Aretha Franklin, I'm speaking of, she was at a low in her recording musical career. She goes to Reverend Cleveland, who worked for her father in his church.
yeah,
She entrusts him to help her come back to a gospel root and to sing gospel music. And the song, the album that is sold the most of any gospel records ever,
and the most that for her,
and the most for her
yeah,
ever. Right? It's so
yeah.
it's
Do you know though? Do you know how I had one colleague to say to me when he went to see the documentary Amazing Grace? He said, I wouldn't have known who that man was talking about Cleveland. He said, if I hadn't talked to you about your research, he said, I wouldn't have known who that was.
wow.
And yeah, I mean, so he's actually one of the most important musicians of the 20th century, yet he's rather unknown beyond the church.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And yet I think what your book and what some of us who do know, that I had the opportunity to get to know him just a little bit,
Yeah.
and get to sit in his presence and play bid whist with him,
Yeah.
and to have him just be a regular person, not the James Cleveland. He was that to me. He was that, but he was also just a regular. I've never been around a more generous person, and a more down to earth kind of person, who he wasn't, he wasn't the celebrity that he was, in plain regular company, a Midwesterner. So he had all the Midwestern vibe, and he was in Los Angeles. We was in a high highfalutin joint, but he was regular as could be. I counted a gift and a real gift to go back in my memory to those precious moments I had and with others, to spend time with him in that way, watching the genius of it, of who he was as a person. Then, be in the setting. We in Madison Square Garden, and gospel music was in a pickle a bit in at that moment in the late 80s, and watch him really, really, really conjure, let me use your term, conjure a kind of spirituality. And what it did, it reintroduced, for example, Tremaine Hawkins to us as a solo artist, and I can go down the line. I can go just down the line. And I pray that we do allow for in our talking about him and the importance of who he in particular was and is to not only the gospel music idiom, but I would say Black music. We've got to call, some of the folk who actually were the progenitors and the change agents. I mean, as much as Dr. Dorsey's contribution and considerable, I believe James Cleveland's contribution is considerable in a similar way.
I agree.
Yeah, I do. So lastly, we got just a few minutes left, and I told you we'll get you back again. We talk about some of the other stuff that you do and that you've been working on. What would you say? We're in an interesting place, and just recently, a documentary just was released a few weeks ago. One of our contemporaries, in a way to introduce a record, all of a sudden has some stuff going. I'm talking about Kirk Franklin, and have some stuff happen, and I had to pause. I was preached yesterday that everybody that presents around us, they present in a certain kind of way and they do whatever it is that they do, and what you don't often remember is that there's a backstory to how they come to the moment to be in an encounter with you. And I was reminded that Kirk, his story, the brilliance and genius of him comes to us from a backstory. Reverend Cleveland had a similar backstory that we don't, that's not known, and you will bring some of that to bear. Talk a little bit about that comes, and we've been bouncing around it a little bit, but that kind of knowing, that kind of something that comes, that backstory that comes and presents itself. What would you say in this moment, now that we have what we have in I'll say religious music, Black religious music in particular, that leaves me somewhat wanting more? What would you say? This is you've been in this field for, I won't name the number, but a long time.
Well, I think I think that Reverend Cleveland and I can't think of this man's name. He's was a good friend of Charlene Moore's, and he was in the first iteration of the James Cleveland Singers. Gene Viali. When I interviewed him before he passed, he said something to me, and I'll never forget how he said it. He said that when they were on the road, that Reverend Cleveland in every city was always concerned about Black people, the plight of Black people, and given his own childhood poverty, I see, speaking of through line, if we could grab something you said, I see in Bishop Hawkins, in Reverend Cleveland, for sure, in Thomas Whitfield and Andre Crouch, the through line to me is working class struggle. That isn't it interesting that gospel is born out of these Black working class people, and that when you listen to migration era gospel songs, it's about, do you think of Roberta Martin? It's about, God's specialty is the impossible. This is a material, this music is about material scarcity and God's abundance to provide. And so I think that gospel for many decades had been held together by working class struggle. I listened to the music that Walter Hawkins, was writing, and the message was the same as Reverend Cleveland's, and it was the same as Mr. Dorsey's, that you can make it. Well, who needs to know that, right? It's people, with their backs against the wall, and I feel, and I wish I didn't feel this way, and I certainly am not saying this to accuse anybody of anything, but I feel like the music is kind of disconnected from struggle, and it was born of struggle. And maybe somebody will reclaim that aspect of it. And for people like Reverend Cleveland, the way to express that was the blues. That stuff is nothing but the blues to me.
Well, it's not just to you. It is the blues, and the lyric of life and life giving and hope, and hope born out of struggle.
Yeah, and hope against hope, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, it's Thurman's. What does the religion of Jesus have to say to a group of people whose back is against the wall? It is that, Dr. Jabir. It's every bit of my heart. And I appreciate you saying yes. I'll have to have you back. We have to talk some more. We just began.
Have me in the morning when my brain is really spiky.
I know. Y'all don't know, but I know this man gets up early in the morning, and he's best now. He about ready to go. He gonna be in the bed in a few minutes. He gonna be asleep. So I know he did this because I asked, and I appreciate you so very much.
Oh, please, you don't have to do that. I'm not especially virtuous for that.
Oh, yes, you are. Yes, you are. Because I know the time of day it is. It ain't nothing else but this time of day. So I appreciate you very much doing this.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for asking me. You certainly have many people to choose from. So thank you.
We're gonna talk again. I certainly want to have you back once the book is published and out, about Dr. Cleveland. Well, that too, Reverend Cleveland, for sure, and talk more about some of the backstories. Right, there's some stories. There's some stories.
There's a lot of humor.
That's right. That's right.
He had. I'll just say this, and then I'm done. But he had a really notorious sense of humor.
Oh, I was living witness of it.
Yes,
and could storytell and have you all. Again, playing cards. He'd be talking, telling stories, and win in the hands.
Yeah.
And I don't know how he was doing all of that.
Distracting you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
John. Okay.
All right. I appreciate it very much. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you all. We'll see y'all again next week or very soon. Same channel, same time. Give or take a couple of minutes. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Peace.
Bye.